we have now a talk by Jenny Smith, which I gather is to do with her time with shelter, which I'm sure is going to be, like all of her other talks, interesting. So whenever you're ready, Jenny.
Right, thank you.
Proceed.
I looked at all my diaries. I've got every single diary since 1972. And I started to look.
You started what?
You've muted yourself, Jenny.
Jenny, you're now muted. Please unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
I moved the mouse away. I think the paperwork touched the mouse.
Right.
Right. Anyway, 1981 in July, I applied for a job with Shelter, went for an interview, and I got it. So I started, I only had about a week and a bit from leaving training at UWE to becoming a shelter worker. About April in that year, my eldest daughter got married. So the house started to unclutter itself from children because they were adults and out in the world and doing all the things that they normally want to do. I was attending Keynsham Quaker meeting. I had been since 1972 doing the door. They're doing the children's meeting, taking, and also I was with Don Doling, going out with the children's groups that wandered around the West Country, taking them to places and events. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And some of the youngsters I even come across today. We had fun. And I attended monthly meetings and learnt more about the beliefs of the society, but never quite felt that I was a proper Quaker. I still don't. But I wouldn't want to belong anywhere else in the world. I attended general meetings in places like Street and the West Country so that I was getting a wider vision of how nice many of the people were. And I was a school governor, by the way, in Waycroft School and Brislington School, which my children attended. I started work at Shelter, as I said, in 81. The office was in Thomas Lane behind the Fleece and Perkin in a very old warehouse building. It was on the top floor. There was extraordinary little facilities, and the last section to go to our floor was via a metal spiral stairway. In winter, when it rained, we had buckets out, and I soon learned that many of our clients had various illnesses and were showing signs. Some of them were showing signs of mental illness. Many of them, we were the last hope, and that became obvious. I felt we weren't miracle workers, and I really worry about my first 1 or 2 years with Shelter because I was in a learning curve and I felt I wasn't learning fast enough. I wanted to be like some of the other workers. I worked alongside Hilary Gilmore and Jan, and to this day, Hilary and I are friends. She was a wonderful worker, and she taught me a lot without her even knowing it. When she did a case, I used to read the case write-up so that I had some idea of what I should be asking, what I should be finding out about, and how I should do the cases. I did one of my first housing. Oh, I went to London for training as well, to the Shelter office. But one of my first cases I inspected was on the 19th of January 1982. It was in Sussex Place, which is down in St Paul's, and near the Albert Villa Advice Centre, where I had been involved for a long time. It was in appalling conditions, and despite being old, belonged to the City Council. Bristol City had not only built council houses, they had bought properties um, all over the city. It also was the sort of old Victorian building that you would want to put a section on it to keep it because it was part of the history of the city. However, the West Indian woman that lived in it was dealing with just about everything from the sewers going to the roof leaking and damp on outside walls. Hillary, who worked with me, did what they call a Section 157, which was a statutory nuisance in Sevier Street, which is nearby. It's in St Werburgh's. She served it upon the City Council, and when it received little or no notice by the City Council, and they were putting her down as she had to be a novice and didn't know what she was talking about, she sent it to the Ombudsman. So we knew that we were trying to convince a local authority that didn't want to know that some of their properties weren't in good condition. I also remember a bus driver coming in and complaining about what was happening to him and doing that case, but I can't remember the details. At the same time, I became the chair of the Labour Women's Council for Bristol, which covered the whole city, because Janet Cox had divorced Mike Cox, who was the chief whip of the Labour Party. I worry to this day that it was because she had initiated a major lobby in Parliament and told all us women, and we told the whole of the Southwest, that there was a plan to let men have the child benefit, not give it to the woman. And I told you in one of my last, anyway, I ended up being chair of the Labour Women's Council. I still attended community meetings in Easton and St Paul's to keep a tab of what was going on in the community. And I went to Fairfield CND when it first started at Fairfield Aerodrome and helped get out CND leaflets. So I was doing other things. I was only working 3 days a week initially for shelter. So I didn't work full time, which meant I still had time to do these other things. And as I said, I was going up for training in London. There was a highly active Tribune group in Bristol at the time, which had split the Labour group. About 6 or 7 Labour councillors have refused to go along with the old Labour group and had formed their own group. And I was friendly with people like George Micklewright, who was in it, and Vivian Bath, and many of the others that I see today who are older citizens in Bristol. This infuriated many older councillors, as you can expect. I was still attending meetings of the St Paul's Advice Centre and was an active member of C&D, as I said, but started to find it hard to keep up my meetings at the St Paul's Advice Centre, so slowly withdrew. There was another worker in the office, as I said, called Jan. I found the only way to talk to Jan was to know which pub she was in, and sadly she had a drinking problem. And after about a year, I think she left, which meant that somebody called Mike Friel joined us. We moved out of that building and we moved to Bond Street, which was owned by, I found out when they evicted us, that was owned by the Bristol City Council. It was appalling. We didn't have a cleaner, we didn't have anything. It was too small. All the things and records were all on top of us, and the place was filthy. And we had, while we were there, uh, two fires that we had to stop because the only heating that we had was a heater that was run on electricity, but it wasn't safe. It really wasn't safe as a heater. Anyway, the situation was solved because we got issued with an eviction notice because someone hadn't paid the rent. So Shelter got evicted out of their office there. And it was amazing. We went to joined up with the Aled Richards Trust, which was down in a little lane right at the bottom of Park Street that you can only just get a car into, turn round and come back again out of. If you
Jenny,
yes,
I can't lip read you. What did you say? Some place or another you had to go to?
right at the bottom of Park Street is a little obscure lane. Evidently, it used to be where there was a monastery. It was part of the monastery where the hotel is now on. And we went into that building with the Allied Richards Trust, who were giving support and help for people with AIDS. And well, there wasn't much help for people with AIDS initially, was there? There was absolutely nothing for them. And we were on the second floor, and they were on the third and the fourth floor in the same building. We got on very well with them, and we shared their kitchen. And when you think about all the hype about we could catch it, we didn't. No, none of us did. But we were moving among people who looked absolutely like skeletons at times for what that was doing to their bodies. Um, can I say that I was active still in politics, and we're coming up to Tony Benn's election where he lost. So I was working hard for my days off on other things, and I was on the executive of Bristol East eventually. I remember one district party conference where Jack Fisk tried to strangle a militant. So it was getting very hectic in politics in the city at that time, partly because of the split that was going on in the group. And as a school governor, I was learning things about the system. You don't realise how much you learn from doing some of these tasks. And I interviewed for the new Crossway School, which was a special needs school for young children. So I was learning to relate and be able to talk to people from all walks of life. There were no barriers left. I was still meeting also with Fred Morehouse about the language scheme, and we were monitoring what was happening to it and where it had gone. I remember also doing a house in Park Street. Oh, by the way, looking at my diary, I was doing at least 6 inspections of houses a day, all over Easton, all over St Werburgh's, and the one I remember in Totterdown taught me that Totterdown was built with sand-baked bricks, which meant that they'd never been put in an oven, and therefore they were beginning to crumble. They also had valley roofs, and if you know about valley roofs in the city, it's where birds go to die. They seem to love getting on roofs to pass out of this world, but then block all the gutters so the roofs start to leak and damp comes into the houses. Some of the houses in the city turned out to not have anything to stop a rising damp. Um, let, let, Later on, I learned that there was a dangerous buildings officer in the city, and I rang him about a house which was Lower Eastern, and said to him, these tenants, when they sit on the toilet, can look through a crack into their neighbour's house. And he wouldn't believe me. And I nagged and I nagged and I nagged, and the phone calls went through, and eventually he went and he agreed that that house was splitting in two. So we were beginning to ensure that the City Council Environmental Health Department were listening to us. Can I point out that part of Eastern is built on old coal mines, and the old miners used to dig holes to get a good vein of coal if they heard that somebody else had found it, but never charted many of the tunnels that they actually built. I was starting to get into St George, which was also an old coal mining area, and the caseload was growing. Hilary and I just worked our cotton socks off. The good thing was that when I'd been training back in the 70s, I became a touch typist, which meant I could type up all my casework quite quickly. And also I could still do the shorthand so that I could take notes quite fast. And I also occasionally went back to the Bristol Council Voluntary Service to listen to what was happening in healthcare in the city, partly because many of the people we were dealing with had various health issues and disabilities, but not just because they'd come from poverty, but from some of the environments that they were living in. On the 7th of March, I think it was 81 or 82, we ran a peace meeting in Keynsham, and Tony Benn was the speaker. And somewhere in this house, I know I had the minutes or a draft of what was said, which some kind friend took and sent me a copy of. And I am going to put that into the archives for the Quaker socialist group so they know that that took place, because I think that's a historic event that many friends do not know took place.
Sorry, what meeting took place?
A meeting of the Quaker Peace meeting in Keynsham Meeting House. And the minutes of that I'm going to make sure are put into the archives. Because we were putting in all these complaints, what we were then doing was sending them to the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman said that I was going in for a world record on how many I was sending to them. And questions were being asked outside Bristol about the standards that they were accepting. We also decided, and I got magistrates in to look at some of the properties. I remember being in Easton when we had a JP come to look at the house, and she was in high heel shoes, and we were showing her a house where the landlord was expecting the people on the top floor to pay rent and get there by a ladder, and that half the house hadn't got windows and hadn't got all sorts of things, and they were still intent. It was the only roof they had, and he was pulling it down around their ears to get rid of them. I met with the Director of Environmental Health and Rod Lambourne, who was his deputy, to discuss these with an environmental health officer from London. and I was there only to take notes. So I wasn't saying anything. And the environmental officer was talking about the cases that we had flooded into Bristol Environmental Health Department. He was very angry. I understood from what he said. I didn't know it, but that's where I learnt. He said, and you're not going to cause me to have a heart attack, young woman, looking at me across the room. And so it was the first thing I knew that our casework was hitting home inside the council, at least, and making them think that there might be a major problem. Um, when we came out, oh, by the way, Rod Lambourne took over eventually from Harry Page and became the Chief Environmental Health Officer for Bristol. He and I are still friends. He was the junior sitting around watching what was happening among the old establishment. And he did his best he could when he became Chief Environmental Health Officer for Bristol to start clearing up the mess. It was going to cost a fortune, and it was housing owned by the city as well as private landlords. Anyway, we got outside, me with this environmental health officer, and he said, "Where are we going next? You've got 2 houses to show me." So I said, "Yes, they're in Sussex Place, St Paul's," and I took them down to number 18 and 20. When he'd seen it and we were outside on the doorstep, he said, "I think we ought to get a writ of mandamus on this." He said, "Where's the nearest solicitor?" And I said, "Well, it's down just past the St Paul's Advice Centre. There is a solicitor's practice there that does sometimes do housing." But I think it was a turning point. It was the moment when I had convinced one of the national respected environmental health officers that we 2 women weren't making it up. We were looking at housing stock that was not only unsafe, it was a statutory nuisance, it was unfit for human habitation, it was in appalling conditions. I can name the roads in Bristol. There were road after road. I could still sit on the bus and think, I wonder if that's been done. And I remember one in Totterdown on Hill Street that at the front window was slowly walking down the hill, the bay window coming away from the house. And if you know what Hill Street is like, you know it's like the South Cole. It's really steep. But the other thing I remember about that house, I haven't got this in my notes, but it's suddenly come to me, was I said to the health visitors, I was calling in where I found that there was ill health in houses and people were who should have got help weren't getting help. But I said to them all the time, don't look at the sitting room and the dining room. That's where people see how they think they are. Go and look at the bedrooms. Go and see where the children sleep. And I was finding blankets that you could look through. And if they were lucky, they had bedding, good bedding, the children, and all sorts of other things. And the health visitors then started to work really hard in Bristol. And I'm still friends with one of them. She lives down by the docks. And as far as I'm concerned, Fleur Luce is a wonderful person. She really worked Bedminster and Knoll West, and she worked it hard. She has a very middle class accent. I don't know how that went down in the houses, but I do know that she cared a great deal about the people she was looking after. Um, uh, Yes, Somerset Terrace, Totterdown, I remember doing as well. There's so many of them. I saw the worst of Bristol. I saw behind closed doors, and I think people should remember that. We talk about poverty, but we don't actually see it, and I was seeing it, and it was hurting me, but it was making me so angry. I was sending in ombudsman complaints, getting magistrates in, and so was Hillary. We were both working our cotton socks off. And our casework multiplied because people, word of mouth, were telling each other that we existed. And I remember talking to women's sections about the rape crisis line and letting them know that it was there and they didn't know about it.
Sorry, what line?
Rape crisis line there was in Bristol. It was set up about the same time. The women's group did it, and oh, I'm going to forget her name, aren't I? I will come back to you sometime with the name of the person I know that was one of the prime movers of setting that up. But we also had, I think I told you before, the St Paul's Advice Centre at night had an emergency line for homosexuals to talk to get support, and to feel that they weren't completely alone in this world with the fact that they had a problem being the sex they were. Um, yeah, he then found out that some of the flats off of St Paul's, one Abraham's Close, was also in a mess. So the city council were having buildings and properties built, new ones, that were not up to standards and broke the rules. Yeah, it was, by the way, it was John McQuillan who came with me for the director of environmental services, the environmental health officer from London. But I was also friendly with environmental health officers all over the country, some of the best there were. We were beginning to drag into the city to see what was going on, and it was working. Um, I remember, I've got this, and I'm going to tell you something personally. On the 9th of May, which was a Sunday, I had to talk at Alveston Church in Thornbury about what the work of shelter. And my daughter, the night before, had taken an overdose because a boyfriend had dropped her. And I had spent the whole of the night in the BRI with her being stomach pumped and sorted, and had to go off to Alveston Church, Thornbury, having handed her over to her father to do it. And I always remember standing there and thinking, that awful world we live in. Um, I was friendly with Molly Packer, who some of you might remember, the older friends, and Charles Hobday, the Social Services Committee on Avon County Council. They were useful. They were useful because I was finding things that they really should have known about. I can also remember having fun. On my motorbike, I went and helped run a shelter stall at Glastonbury Festival. I slept in a tent, and it ended up filling up with all sorts of people sleeping all around me, and somebody with his head on my feet, which was one of the other workers that joined us in shelter. And meeting young people. I think meeting young people helps older people. It gives us back fresh life to go on in the world doing the things we're doing. I was when I helped with the young friends, I was friendly with Fred Morehouse and his wife, and sadly he died about that time. He'd been out in Rhodesia. He'd helped with a school for mixed race children, and it was racially diverse, and he then came back to the UK and was involved in all sorts of initiatives. And he was on the management committee that had helped the language scheme get off the ground.
Who was that?
Fred Morehouse. He was an absolutely wonderful Quaker and a light to us all, showing us the way that life could be led and how you did not accept things when they were wrong. They also had stalls at St Paul's festivals, and we picketed the Evening Post when they were writing racial articles or articles that could be interpreted as racist against the black community in Easton and St Paul's. And I used to have meetings of Quakers in my house from Keynsham, and clearly a lot of the work I was doing, I carried into politics and made absolutely sure that councillors and MPs and everybody else understood what we were finding in our casework as we worked through the city. We couldn't divulge names unless the person whose house it was wanted to be referred to a councillor or an MP. But we could actually tell them the conditions that we were seeing. Marjorie Evans was about that time, and Marjorie Evans was absolutely stalwart of doing things and helping, and her story was absolutely fascinating. She'd raised money for the Labour Party back in the old docks area where the docks was full of merchant ships from all over the world. And she used to sell matches to the seamen to raise money for the Labour Party. But she also went on and did all sorts of work among elderly people in the city. And I think that these people should not be forgotten. I often think they do get, which is a shame. By this time, I was working absolutely solidly, working slowly out to the fringes of the city, and I have decided I can't talk about all I did in shelter with one go. I'm going to stop in 1985, you will find, which is coming up. But I remember we had a wonderful holiday walking the Kennet and Avon Canal. So I was getting other things in my life. And then on the 27th, 1982, my daughter Caroline got married. So the family at home was thinning down. Also was friends with a man called Paul Chamberlain. And I think that he also ought to be remembered for what he did later. He was involved in the poll tax and objecting to it. And he eventually ended up being thrown in prison. And after he came out of prison and they'd released him at Christmas, he went back to the Bristol prison and threw food and presents over the wall to the inmates while they were on their walkabout just before prison. I think it's amazing how some people can get on well educated, but to find out what the other side of the coin is like for other people. I was still involved with the Tesla. We'd run 2 conferences over the initial years of me working for Shelter. One was in Brighton and the other one was in Bristol. And also at the time, there was a big issue about whether we went into the common market or not, and speakers all over the city about that. So there were other issues taking place. Things were changing in the city, and I don't think people realised that so much history was going through about the same time as I was working for shelter. I was a member of NUPE. I was friends with Rodney Bickerstaff, and later on, he did some wonderful work and help with me with the gypsies and traveller issues that I picked up. Because homeless people are not just in squats, they're not just on your streets.
Sorry, what were you a member of?
He was National Union of Public Employees. He was a union member. He was the chief officer nationally. So I started to get friendly with him, but it was more about other issues, and it was quite interesting how it eventually turned out to be a very sensible person that I needed for some of the changes that we were trying to bring about. I had to go into prisons to do talks to prisoners. I went to Ley Hill a number of times and various other prisons around. I always joke I've been in every prison in the Bristol area. Haven't been in the Somerset one. It was the one I didn't get asked to. And I did talks to prisoners about what life was going to be like when they came out, where the accommodation agencies were, what the Rent Acts allowed them to do, how they must find agencies to help them if they were in trouble, and to try to get them so that when they walked out the door of that prison, they weren't going back to their old life. They were actually going to be able to get a roof over their head and money in their pocket and hopefully a job, so that they didn't have to do some of the crimes that some of them have committed in the past. Ley Hill, if you know it was one of the places where their hardest criminals come out back into the community. And I noticed that Eileen Means was turning up at a speaker, and she's still around Bristol, and she used to work for social services in North Bristol, was in charge of it. She was a speaker to the Stockwood Women's section at the time. So that I was extending my friends around the city. Some of us are still friends with each other. People don't realise. And the language scheme changed its name. It came away from being called BELTS, which was Bristol English Language Tuition Scheme, to PALSA. And it's, I think, until it died eventually under the cuts, People and Language Scheme Association, that stands for. So that it was drifting away off to be with run by the local authority and run by professional people who knew exactly how to teach other people a new language. Caroline Benn was a speaker to Bristol Women's Council. I tried hard to get off of a motorbike. I decided that riding a motorbike off to conferences out miles away wasn't actually a sensible thing to do, especially when bees seem to get down the front of my clothes and things when you hit them driving. But I wasn't doing very well at passing my test. It didn't help. I have various talks here, but I also attended talks. I gave a talk to the Sandy Park talk on Quakerism. I can't understand why, but somehow or other that happened. But I also went to talks on the medical effects of nuclear warfare. I was the first in the office to decide I needed a mobile phone. It was very, very big, large, heavy. I had to pay for all the calls myself, but I decided I was going into places that other people didn't ever feel safe in, and maybe just having a phone was a sensible thing to do. I will tell you that I went into squats, and I going through kitchen windows over draining boards doesn't do your knees very good, but I was trying to find a young man who had just got an offer for accommodation, and he was a squatter, so he didn't have an address, he didn't have a phone number, and we had to reach out to him to find him wherever he was. And I found him, and he moved in to have a roof over his head. Also having an awful lot of trouble then with physically, and I went to an anaesthetist, an acupuncturist, and walked home feeling like I had a great lump taken off the back of my back. It was terrific, and I will tell you that as far as I'm concerned, acupuncture works. It helped me. I do wonder sometimes whether it was just the stress of the work that I was doing. Um, By this time, we were beginning to get into places like Hillfields, Knoll West. And the other thing that came out, I remember the Knoll West case. And I remember it because I felt that somewhere the system had decided that this family with children weren't worth helping. And so the conditions were appalling. The house wasn't in good condition, and they really, all that needed doing to it couldn't be done with them living in it. We managed to get them moved to a nice newer hospital, a house, and that was on the very edge of the city at Hartcliffe. I hope that they lived well from then on, but it certainly came over that there were people that are chosen by society to not be helped because they were judged on the clothes that they wore or their language or whatever it was, judged ahead of time. Now, about that time, we were trying to raise funding for shelter because we were struggling and there were going to be redundancies and all the rest of it. And I went off to see a union leader to ask him for help financially if there was any possibility. He's dead. I'm going to tell you who he was. It was Bruno Puss. Anyway, what happened was he decided I was there for him to have sex with. So I was getting around the room, trying to avoid him at all costs, and suddenly discovered that I got as far as the door and the door handle was in the back of my back. So I got out fast. Many years later, I met with Anne Mainwaring. Marion Mainwaring, and she's had the same trouble. But she'd known his wife, and she went off and told her what he was up to. And I thought, well, there is justice eventually. So we older women don't talk about these situations, and we should, because the young ones are walking into some of the same traps, aren't they? But I got away and didn't get any money. But at the same time, I had learnt that I should be very, very careful as a woman wherever I was in our society that we live in. I inspected places like Brighton Street, and I got involved in the school play bus somehow or other. I think basically because I felt that we needed places like that for the children to go in. I took food on the 20th, 1984 to Greenham Common. I have an old jam cauldron, filled it up with hot food. We put it on a fire at Greenham, and the women all had a hot cooked meal. during the elections in 1983, as I told you, Tony Benn lost Bristol East, which set shockwaves through the city. It was quite interesting what happened that evening. I remember saying very loudly, now the children have got to grow up. And that's what happened. Many of today's politicians, or the old ones that have been through, were actually around then and weren't councillors and weren't anything else. But suddenly they all realised that if we were to pick up the mantra of decent behaviour and straight thinking in politics, we had got to do it then. Yeah, I joked on election night that if I wanted to burgle a house in Stockwood, I knew every empty property in the whole of the ward. Avon County Council had been formed in the beginning of the 70s, I think, or 80s. Maybe it was the 80s. And I helped Bernard Chalmers, who was a Avon County councillor, with a policy document on libraries, sports facilities, and helped write the Labour Party manifesto for the City Council. And I remember a picnic in the Forest of Dean where my mother turned up on her motorbike in her 80s, riding a motorbike, and Tony Benn was absolutely blown over by the fact that my mother was doing that at her age. But we're that sort of family. My son was at Brislington School by that time, so he was the youngest, and it meant that I was beginning to get away from having to do a lot of caring for the children. I attended the University of Warwick yearly meeting on the 25th of June 1982, and it was the first time I suddenly realised I was listening to a talk about lesbianism, and I thought, I have never even thought about that in the world. I have since, and I have met lots of women that have chosen to love other women and not go out and marry men, which I understand. Dominic Murphy and Sue started to work for us, and they did a lot of really good work. So we were getting backup from other people, but then suddenly our working for with the Age Trust stopped, as the people who owned the building wanted the building back. I think that having the combination of homeless people and people with AIDS in their building perhaps affected the fact that they wanted us to move. And we moved down near the car park on the top of the building there, the main car park on the shopping centre. So we moved yet again. Shelter kept moving because we were bringing what was seen as undesirable people into the areas where we had our office. I found a reference to Richard Nile, Cathy's husband, it was, in 1983. He and Cathy moved down to get away from threats of violence when he had been a solicitor taking on Rackman in London. He must have wished he hadn't, because we started to give him cases of where landlords were treating people horrendously, where children and families were at risk. And I noticed recently people were talking about women being expected to pay sex to just keep a roof over their heads. Well, yes, we also found that families were being asked to allow the landlord or his friends to have sex with their children as well.
It's
So it was all there. You're going to
Jen-
stop me, aren't you?
it's 5 to 12, Jenny.
Oh dear, I'm sorry. Right. Can I say that what I saw of the world wasn't nice? But it was in a way because there were wonderful people out there doing the most amazing things. Um, that I was going to end by telling you that I became a Avon County councillor in 1985, which was part of the reason I actually ended up getting involved in Gypsies and Travellers. So it was not just a job that you've got to be really strong to even put up with what we saw and did. And yes, I had landlords yelling that I shouldn't be in the property inspecting it when one found me in there in Weston-super-Mare. But at the same time, I really think I needed the strength of friends. Quakers were always around to help. Quakers were people I could talk to, people I felt loved the world that we lived in. And what you try to do is, when you do a job like that, you try to hand people back their life to have a fresh start. That's it. Well, you wanted to know what it was like working for shelter, warmth and all.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Interesting and inspiring to us all. I think I could say to that, may I ask friends here for comment or questions to Jenny?
Don't know. I mean, thank goodness the Quakers were there to sort of, as it were, hold you whilst you're dashing off, involving in all sorts of things. Goodness knows where your kids were at the time, but they were grown up a bit, weren't they?
Yes, yeah. Well, Caroline and Penny, when she got married, went up and took a degree in Camberwell. And Caroline went off and married somebody who already had lots of money. She still has to this day. It was just David, but David got a petition up in Brisbane School demanding that they had two places to buy sweets, not one, because the queues were so long, half the children couldn't get what they wanted. And he got two tuck shops in Brisbane School put together for them.
Two schools put together.
No, two tuck shops.
I don't know what a pet shop is in this context.
Food shops. Well, you buy sweets and things.
Tuck.
And,
Tuck.
Oh, Tuck.
Yeah.
All I can say is my children have done things that are interesting as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Have you any views of the housing situation in Bristol at the moment?
Oh yes, I still know quite a lot about it because I went on to be councillor in Southmead, didn't I?
Went on to be what?
Councillor in Southmead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I went in to work to one of the areas that had poverty in. And now people are saying Southmead isn't like Southmead used to be.
Meaning?
Well, I did a lot of work there. I condemned a lot of the property and helped people get things. And I was on the rating valuation panel at the time in the 80s, so I could help people lower their rates because I knew the tricks.
Yeah, I would say our houses are cold in general, and some of them are falling down around your ears. Eastern,
Yeah,
they've got great big chunks of wood and scaffolding poles to prop up bits inside, and that's what the Home Office is paying for asylum seekers to stay in that I know of. Kitchen's like a little passage shared with 4 different people living in different rooms.
yeah, no, it's still there.
There's plenty of work still to do, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it needs strength, help for the people that are doing it. And shelter has changed. Shelter just does homelessness now. It doesn't do inspections like we did.
Mm. We don't have rent officers anymore, do we?
No,
I thought that was a sad abolishment. Did they achieve anything?
well, things changed afterwards. I mean, things did improve, but only for a short time. And with things like that, you've got to start putting down rules and legislation, and I got tired. Eventually, I got tired, as you will find out if you get the next lot. But I did become the councillor for Henbury, and I was there for 8 years as a councillor. And it was a very good thing because I was learning how other councillors work and having to decide whether I was going to be the same as them or change my image and be slightly different.
Cool.
I suppose one thing which saddens me about housing today in Bristol is you can go round and see magnificent tower blocks being built for students. And there are no such thing being built for people who are on the housing waiting list or just need fair rent properties for them to live in, which I think is a disgrace to this council for that.
But all the rent legislation was going, and I was at shelter, slowly and steadily, all the legislation was changed under the Tory government, and rights were removed. And the only people that really did have old rights left over from the previous years were the older people. And as they died, the property then was slightly revamped if you were lucky, and younger people were moved in that didn't have the inherited rights that some of them had with secure tenancy. All that went, it drifted as the older people died off.
And the newer housing for the university students is a golden opportunity to make money out of them because they have to rent them for the whole year, even if they're not there for the whole year. It's a rip-off.
Mm. My youngest daughter runs a painting and decorating business, and one of her things is to go in the student flats and clean them up and sort them out, ready for the next lot of students. She said she becomes like the student's mum when she goes into those flats.
Mm.
Mm. She was the one that had met multiple head injuries,
Yeah.
and she's still functioning. She gets terrible migraines and asthma and all sorts of things, so not well. Yeah, life is a sod for some people.
Mm.
I think we ought to. Oh, we've got to get an education. We've got to get decent roofs over people's heads so they can relax, not be stressed out. Make it so that it doesn't. It's what isn't worth stealing and ripping off the system. And how about honesty coming back? Being absolute straight about what's happening.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh,
If I go on talking, you have me again. I will go on for the next years because we actually found that the very old properties in the city, some of them, that had been built under the Tories when they were in control of Bristol before the war, were built on sandbags. All right.
So the building inspectorate had not done their job.
Well, was there a building inspectorate before the Second World War? Did
Ah.
they even exist?
Ah, right. So planning permission wasn't really needed for that sort of stuff, perhaps.
And David, this answers you how long I have known Hillary. Hillary is a wonderful person.
Hillary who?
Hillary Gilmore that is now Hillary Saunders. She's lovely.
Hmm.
She is the wordsmith. She's brilliant at putting cases together and issues. And I think the Green movement should value her a great deal because she's among them now.
okay, friends, that seems to be the time that we have between us, and I can't see is there any other comments. So
Keep working for
that's it,
change.
friends, and have a good day.
Yeah, don't give up.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.